In the winter of 1880, Paris was eating salad grown in Paris. The ground outside the city was frozen hard. There were no boilers, no coal, and no machine of any kind heating that ground. The lettuce was coming out of wooden frames, set over heaps of stable sweepings, and the heaps were warm. Warm enough that a gardener could take up to 9 crops off the same ground in 1 year. Warm enough to germinate seed in February in a frozen city. Paris market gardeners worked around 1,400 hectares, roughly 6% of the city, feeding itself through winter. It may be the most productive food system ever run. But inside about 30 years, all of it was gone. Tonight we follow the heat. What a hotbed was. Why the warmth in it is not what almost anyone assumes. How Paris turned it into an industry and what finally shut it down. The answer is not the gardener, and it is not the technique. 30 years before that Paris winter, the same thing was happening in English manor gardens on a smaller scale, and centuries before that in monastery gardens, and the method had barely changed in any of them. A hotbed, stripped to its bones, is a pile of fresh, stable waste with soil on top of it. You dig out a shallow pit, or you build straight up off level ground. You fork the material in a layer at a time, and you tread each layer down firm with your boots, because loose material burns out fast and packed material burns slow. You build it up to something like waist height. Then you cap the whole heap with a few inches of fine soil, set a wooden frame around it, and lay glass over the top. That is the entire apparatus. No flue, no chimney, no fuel to buy, no fire to watch through the night. Within a couple of days, the heap starts to warm. Put your hand into the cap, and it is noticeably warm. Push a stick down into the body of the heap, pull it out, and it will be too hot to hold comfortably. The frame above traps that rising warmth against the glass, and the air inside sits well above the freezing air outside. In a garden with no fuel bill, you now have a warm room the size of a door. What goes into it is everything a cold country cannot otherwise have in winter. Salad leaves, radishes, carrots pulled young and sweet, herbs that would be dead sticks in open ground. And quietly, the most valuable of the lot, seedlings started weeks early, so that when the open beds finally warm, the plants going into them are already strong instead of just germinating. That front-loading is worth more than the winter salad ever was. In a world where the hungry gap ran from late winter deep into early summer, pulling the whole growing year forward by 3 or 4 weeks, was the difference between a thin spring and a comfortable one. There is a commercial edge inside that, and it is a large part of why the technique kept spreading. The first radishes of the year, the first lettuce, the first cucumbers, are worth several times what the identical crop fetches 6 weeks later, when every grower in the district has them. A gardener with a hotbed was not simply eating earlier than his neighbours. He was selling into a market that had no competition in it yet, at a price certain to collapse the moment the open ground caught up. The heat bought him a monopoly measured in weeks, and it bought him one every single year. None of this has to stay on a screen. The Medieval Home Savings Manual collects 35 of these old methods for cutting a household's bills at the Medieval Way store, medievalway.store. I will not mention it again. Enter the part almost every account of this leaves out, which is the question of where that heat is actually coming from. Ask most people why a dung heap is warm, and you get something vague about rot, or about chemistry, or a half-memory that manure is somehow hot stuff. None of that is right. Nothing in the heap is burning. Nothing in it is reacting the way a chemical hand warmer reacts. The heat is alive. It is being produced by bacteria in enormous numbers, working their way through the material and giving off warmth as a waste product, in the same way your own body gives off warmth while it digests. A hotbed is not a furnace at all. It is a colony. That one fact controls everything about how the thing behaves, and it explains every rule the old gardeners followed, whether or not they knew why they were following it. It explains the treading. Pack a heap too loosely and air floods through the whole mass. The bacteria work far too fast and the heat spikes and dies inside a fortnight. Pack it far too tight and air is shut out altogether. A different set of microbes takes over, and instead of a warm bed, you get a cold, sour, stinking heap that will not recover. Treading meters the oxygen, and oxygen is the throttle on the entire engine. It explains the moisture rule that every old account repeats. The material has to be damp like a wrung-out cloth. Bone-dry material does nothing at all because bacteria cannot work without water. Sodden material goes airless and sour for the same reason as overpacking does. It even explains why the gardeners trusted their noses. A bed running correctly smells earthy and faintly sweet. A bed that has gone airless smells sharp and rotten, and that smell is the sound of the engine failing, hours or days before a thermometer would have told you anything. And it explains the single most important piece of practical knowledge about hotbeds, the one that separates a working bed from a tray of dead seed. When a heap first gets going, it runs violently hot. Composting stable waste routinely drives up into the region of 60 degrees Celsius within days, and it can hold up there for weeks. Sow into that and you cook your seed before it ever splits. So the gardener builds the bed, and then he waits. He waits for that first fierce burn to pass, and for the heap to settle to a steady, gentle warmth, somewhere around blood heat. Then he sows. And it is that second, gentler phase that lasts, holding a usable temperature for weeks and often months as the colony works down through the pile. The old gardeners judged it by hand, by nose, and by how fast a buried stick warmed. You can judge it with a cheap thermometer. The mechanism has not changed in 500 years. Which brings us to Paris, where somebody worked out that if this is a machine, it can be run at industrial scale. The Paris market gardeners were called maraîchers, from marais, the marshes, because they had begun on the damp ground at the city's edge. By the 19th century, they had turned that ground into something with no real parallel anywhere. Around 1,800 separate gardens, roughly 9,000 people working them, 1,400 hectares between them, and an average holding of only 1 or 2 acres, which tells you immediately that the productivity was coming from intensity and not from land. The layout was a grid of glass. Wooden frames over hotbeds ran in long rows, and among them stood bell jars, cloches, thick glass domes about 18 inches across, each one a private greenhouse for a single plant. The work was relentless, and it was mostly about air. A gardener spent his day lifting, tilting, propping and closing glass, venting a frame that had climbed too warm in the sun, shutting one down before a clear cold night, moving cloches off a crop that had outgrown them and onto one that had just gone in. The heat was free. The attention was not, and the attention is what 9,000 people were actually being paid for. And the warmth was not confined to the beds. The gardeners packed decomposing material into the walkways between the frames as well, so the paths themselves radiated heat and lifted the temperature of the whole enclosure. The entire site was gently heated, floor included, rather than a set of warm boxes standing in a cold field. 9 crops a year off one plot does not mean 9 plantings running politely one after another. A good part of it came from stacking. The maraîchers interplanted deliberately, setting a fast crop such as radish between the rows of something slow like carrots or lettuce, so the quick one was harvested and gone before the slow one needed the room. The same square of ground carried 2 crops at once for part of its life, and the calendar was written so that the moment a bed came clear, the next crop was already raised and hardened off and standing by to go straight into it. Nothing was ever permitted to sit empty, not under glass that had cost real money, and not over heat that was running whether a plant was using it or not. 2 men, Moreau and Daverne, wrote the practice down in a manual of Paris market gardening published in 1845, and the detail in it reads like the documentation of a mature industry rather than a folk habit. Half a century later, the Russian geographer Peter Kropotkin studied the same gardens for his book of 1899 and could hardly believe that a capital city was growing its own vegetables inside its own boundaries, in quantity, in winter. 9 crops a year off one plot. Salad in February. Every calorie of the heating coming out of a heap of stable sweepings. And the trick is not the dung at all. Take a hotbed apart in your head and ask what the bacteria are actually eating. They need carbon in bulk in a form they can chew through slowly. Manure on its own does not give them that. It is wet. It is nitrogen rich. It goes airless and sour quickly, and it slumps into a dense mass instead of holding the open structure that air has to move through. A heap of pure dung is a poor hotbed and an unpleasant one. What the bacteria are really eating is the straw. Straw is the carbon. Straw is slow to break down, which is exactly the property you want, because slow breakdown is a long, steady burn instead of a short, violent one. Straw also props the pile open, so air reaches the whole mass rather than the outer foot of it. The dung is the starter, the nitrogen and the bacterial inoculation that gets the colony fed and running. The straw is the fuel that keeps it running for months. So a hotbed is not a manure heater. It is a device for burning straw slowly, at low temperature, without flame. Now look at where a 19th century gardener actually got that mixture, and the whole story reorganizes itself around a different animal. He did not buy straw, buy manure, and blend the two to a ratio. He took stable sweepings, and a stable floor is straw bedding that a horse has been standing on, urinating into, and dunging onto for days on end. It arrives already mixed, already wetted, already inoculated, in roughly the proportion the process needs, because the animal and its bedding did the blending for him. The horse was not supplying fuel for the hotbed. The horse was the mixing plant, which means the Fireless furnace was never free, and it was never really a garden technology at all. It was the downstream end of something enormous. A 19th century city ran on horses in a way that is genuinely hard to picture now. Every cab and every omnibus, every brewery dray, every delivery cart, every load of coal moved from the yard to the door. Fire engines, private carriages, tens of thousands of animals inside one city, every one of them housed in a stable, bedded on straw, and producing waste every day of the year without a single day off. That waste was a standing municipal problem. It had to be shifted constantly, and shifting it cost somebody money. The market gardeners on the city's edge were the disposal system, and they were solving a problem the city was extremely glad to hand over. So the input arrived cheaply, reliably, in industrial volume, all year round, with nobody having to grow it, cut it, dry it, or cart it any real distance. A gardener in the countryside with one horse could build one modest hotbed. A gardener on the edge of Paris could build them by the 100, because Paris was manufacturing the raw material as a byproduct of simply existing. That is the real reason this technique reached the scale it did, in that place at that moment. Not superior skill, supply, which is also why it ended, and the ending has almost nothing to do with gardening. The horse left the city. From the early years of the 20th century, and decisively after the First World War, the internal combustion engine took over the work animals had been doing. Cabs became taxis, drays became trucks, omnibuses became buses. The stables emptied one street at a time, and the straw and the manure that had come out of them every morning simply stopped arriving. The clock had been running on the maraîcher for years, and nobody working those frames could hear it. The thing that was going to end their industry was not a frost, not a blight, and not a rival with better glass. It was a machine that had nothing to do with food, taking over a job that had nothing to do with gardening. A second pressure arrived at the same moment. Paris kept growing. Land at the edge of the city became worth far more with buildings on it than with cloches on it, and the gardens were sold and built over. After the First World War, the whole culture maraîchère waned in France and in England alongside it. Sit with the shape of that, because it is the reverse of the usual story about lost knowledge. Nobody found a better method. The technique was not disproved, not outcompeted, and not forgotten by the people who knew it. It worked perfectly on the day it stopped. Its fuel supply was retired by an unrelated industry, and a system that could feed a capital through winter on waste became impossible to run at scale, not because it failed, but because the horses went away, which is exactly why you can still build one, and that is the useful part of all this. Start with sourcing, because sourcing is now the whole game. You are not looking for a bag of composted manure from a garden centre. Composted material has already given up its heat. That is what composted means. You want fresh stable waste with the straw bedding still in it, and the place to get that is a riding school, a livery yard, or a racing stable, most of which are currently paying somebody to take it away and will hand it over for nothing. If the bedding is wood shaving rather than straw, it will still work, but it runs cooler and slower, so add straw if you can get it. Build in late winter, 6 to 8 weeks before you want to sow. Mark out an area a foot wider than your frame on every side, because the outer edge of a heap always runs cooler, and you do not want your growing area sitting on a cold rim. Fork the material in layers of 6 inches or so, treading each layer firm as you go, until the heap stands 2 to 3 feet high. Firm, not compacted. Damp, not wet. Cap it with 4 to 6 inches of decent soil, set the frame on top, lay the glass, and then leave it completely alone. Now use a thermometer and be patient, because impatience is where nearly every modern attempt dies. The heap will climb hard and it will get far too hot for any seed to survive. Wait. When it has come back down to a temperature you could hold your hand in comfortably, and it has held there for 2 or 3 days running, sow. From that point the bed carries you for weeks, and your only real job is venting the frame on bright days so the plants are not cooked from above while they are being warmed from below. As for what to put in it, follow the logic rather than a list. The bed's whole advantage is warmth in cold months, so it is wasted on anything that would grow perfectly well outdoors in May anyway. Use it for salad leaves and radishes you want in late winter, for carrots pulled young, and above all for raising the seedlings that will move into your open beds the moment the weather turns. One caution is worth stating plainly. A fresh bed is a strong environment, and fine seed sown straight into material that is still too rich will sulk or rot. Sow into the soil cap, never into the heap below it, and keep that cap ordinary garden soil rather than something enriched. At the end of the season, you do not throw the heap away. What is left is the best soil most gardeners will ever handle, and the Paris maraîchers built their entire growing medium out of nothing else, year after year. The bed heats you for 1 season and then feeds you for several more. That was always the second half of the machine. Follow the whole chain back and it runs in one direction. A city that needed to move, so it kept horses. Horses that needed bedding, so the city consumed straw by the ton. Straw and dung leaving the stables every morning as somebody's expensive problem. Gardeners who understood that a problem full of carbon is a fuel supply. Frames of glass over warm heaps, and salad in February in a frozen city. And then an engine that made the first link in that chain unnecessary and quietly pulled down every link after it. The frames are gone and the gardens are under apartment blocks. The bacteria never went anywhere. We dig up the knowledge history buried. Would you rather have the February salad or the free heat? Subscribe and keep digging. Until next time.